per worker is clearly unsatisfactory. Yes. Page 6, 10. Although it was not Solo's original intention, it was his neoclassical theory of growth that brought technological progress to prominence as a major explanatory factor in the analysis of economic growth. But somewhat paradoxically, in Solo's theory, technological progress is exogenous. That is not explained by the model. And then beyond the section that you didn't cover, but 623, towards the bottom of the first paragraph. Thus, we end up with a model of growth that explains everything but long-run growth. I'm not being unique in pointing out these weaknesses in the Solo model. Page 616, there is a typo. All right, if you go to page 616, again, the first paragraph about the middle, you have a sentence which says, with a small capital share, typically alpha is 1/3, the average and marginal product of labor declines rapidly as capital deepening takes place. All right, that's obviously the average and marginal product of capital declines rapidly. And then, okay, I think that's all I want to say about that for now. So let me talk a little bit about Herod-Domar, because even though Herod-Domar is a discredited model among mainstream economists, it still is used in the development community a lot, or if not explicitly, at least implicitly. And when one of the things that Snowden and Bain reiterate that I mentioned is that for a while, growth theory was a ghetto in the economic profession, and so it was taken over by non-mainstream economists, development in a field called development economics, where you had various Marxist theories of exploitation. Rich nations are rich because they impoverish poor nations. That was known as dependency theory. The argument that colonialism is what spurred Western economic development. And related to these theories were theories of dualistic development, where you think of the economy as having two bifurcated sectors. That's what Gunnar Myrdal came up with, who shared the Nobel Prize. And all of these theories ended up in suggesting extremely statist policies to encourage economic growth in the post-World War II period. Import substitution, which is high tariffs. Central planning, or if not central planning, sectoral planning, where government would play a large role in trying to drive economic growth. And it did not work out. It did not work out where it was tried. So the interesting thing about the Herod-Domar model is Snowden and Bain's presentation is a little bit misleading because it actually started as a business cycle model to try to expand Keynesian theory. Keynesian business cycle theory in its basic form assumed that the capital stock was fixed. And the Herod-Domar model tried to extend Keynesian theory to an economy where the capital stock would grow. And it used a very peculiar production function. What's known as, well, before I do that, let's talk about how you can visualize production functions. A production possibility frontier, like the one I introduced last week, is looks at a fixed level of inputs over a given period, and the axes are outputs. All right. In other words, looks at the various output opportunities you have with a fixed level of input factors. What I want to start drawing now is production isoquants, which do the reverse of production possibility frontiers or production possibility boundaries. And a production isoquant is a graph that looks at the varying inputs that will give you a fixed level of output. All right, so the line represents a fixed level of output. And the inputs usually are labor on one axis and capital on the other axis. All right? So, labor and capital can be substitutes, or in theory can be substitutes, can be complements, can be a little bit of both. If labor and capital are perfect substitutes, then your production isoquant is going to be a straight line. Right? In other words, 2 units of labor substitute for 1 unit of capital, so you can get this amount of you can get your fixed level of output with this much labor. You reduce the number of labor, you just add more capital. The Cobb-Douglas production function assumes that capital and labor are both substitutes and complements, and that they have diminishing returns. So if you were to graph the Cobb-Douglas production function on a production isoquant, it would look like that. The production function that the Harrod-Domar model used is known as a Leontief production function, named after Wesley Leontief, who was a Russian economist who came to America. He's famous for input-output analysis. He won the Nobel Prize in 1973, and he actually was Solo's teacher. He assumed in his production function that capital and labor were perfect complements. So if you were to write out the production function, right, we have output being a function of capital and labor, and more specifically, the minimum of some factor times capital, some factor times labor, with A being greater than 0 and B being greater than 0. Now, how does that translate into a production isoquant? It looks like this. As Snowden and Bain point out, you have this ninth edge, right? Where these are perfect complements. So you have the right amount of labor for the right amount of capital. If you increase the amount of labor, it's all unemployed. You don't get any increase in output. If you increase the capital stock, it's all idle. You don't get any increase in output. So the Harrod-Domar model combined this with a notion that poor countries have these dualistic economies where essentially the agricultural sector generates a lot of completely idle labor, but available labor. And so the way, if you're here, right, with excess labor, in order to get output per person to go up, you need more capital. In other words, you need to move to this production isoplane. And once you're here, if the population is constant, you don't get any more. It's no longer you no longer can increase output per capita, right? You increase output per capita by moving from here to here because you had idle labor and you increase the capital stock, but you don't get any after this point, right? Increasing capital just gives you idle capital. Now, in an economy with a growing labor force, right, in order to remain on this knife edge, you have to be adding capital so that capital, the amount of capital per worker remains constant. So, it turns out that this model can only explain extensive growth unless you have some exogenous technological change that increases the productivity of the capital, some labor saving. On top of that, the model assumed that the economy is very unlikely to remain at this knife edge because there's no equilibrating forces bringing it there. And therefore, it's going to careen between unemployed labor and secular stagnation unless government drives up saving and investment or excess capital.
I was wondering why in all these models is technology treated as an exogenous variable? Is it really that hard to measure?
Yes. I mean, the only measure we have of it is the Solow residual. And the Solow residual is not a direct measure of capital, of technology. It's just a residual.
Yeah, but you could, if you're trying to count the amount of capital in the country or something, you're going around, you're counting up all these different goods and services, looking at every company and all the things they're making and stuff they're doing, couldn't you just pull out the things that are directly related to technological growth? Number of patents, amount of money spent in R&D.
If you can figure out how to do that, you're going to win a Nobel Prize in economics.
Sweet.
All right? If you can figure out how to directly measure technology, but as we will see, my argument against growth accounting and the Solow model is that growth accounting doesn't even correctly measure the capital stock. So therefore, the Solow residual is what's not explained by our imperfect measures of the factor inputs. That's why it's called a residual. So now, if you're in this situation, right, that means your growth rate of GDP per capita is going to be determined by the rate of savings as a percentage of total output divided by the existing capital stock minus depreciation. All right, because savings has to cover depreciation of the existing capital stock, and then the remaining, right, the percentage increase in the capital stock is the percentage increase in the capital stock after you subtract depreciation is going to give you your rate of growth. That was the formula that Snowden and Bain presented, and then they made it confusing by introducing V as a variable that represented the capital output ratio. And I don't know why they did that, because it didn't get you anywhere in terms of understanding the model. So, I mean, you can follow the math if you want, but now, one of the things about the Herod-Domar model was that it became, it justified what became known as capital fundamentalism. It became a justification for the argument that in order for poor countries to get rich, they needed more capital, which means they needed more savings. There were no diminishing returns to capital along this growth range. And the solution